Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into one of the most controversial and philosophically distinctive arguments for God's existence, the presuppositional argument. Unlike the cosmological or design arguments that try to reason from observations about the universe, presuppositionalism takes a radically different approach. It claims that God's existence is the necessary foundation for reasoning itself. This argument has sparked heated debates between Christian apologists and atheists for decades. But is it actually convincing? By the end of this video, we'll understand what presuppositionists are claiming, where the argument came from, how it evolved, and whether it should persuade a reasonable person. Let's get into it. So what exactly is presuppositionalism claiming? Well, at its core, the presuppositional argument asserts that certain fundamental features of human experience like logic, morality, science, and even the reliability of our senses cannot be rationally justified without presupposing the Christian God, according to presuppositionists. Atheists and adherents of other worldviews are essentially borrowing from the Christian framework whenever they use reason or appeal to objective truth. The argument typically goes something like this. First, presuppositionists claim that everyone operates from foundational assumptions or presupposition that cannot be proven but must be assumed to make sense of anything else. These are the basic beliefs we start with before we can reason about anything. Second, they argue that only the Christian worldview provides a coherent foundation for things like the laws of logic, objective moral values, the uniformity of nature, and human rationality. Why? Because in the Christian view, these features reflect God's unchanging, rational nature. Third, they claim that non-Christian worldviews, particularly atheistic, materialism cannot account for these features. If the universe is just matter in motion following natural laws, why should we trust our reasoning? Why should logic work tomorrow the way it works today? Why should anything be objectively wrong? Finally, the conclusion. Therefore, God must exist as the necessary precondition for intelligibility itself. Any attempt to argue against God's existence would require using logic, reason, and truth, which the presuppositionist claims only make sense if God exists. This makes atheism self-refuting. The most famous formulation comes from Cornelius Van Til, who stated that God is the Transcendental foreknowledge. His student, Greg Bahnsen, popularized what's called the Transcendental Argument for God, or TAG for short. To understand presuppositionalism, we need to go back to the early 20th century and a Dutch Reformed theologian named Cornelius Van Til. Van Til was teaching at Princeton Theological Seminary during a period of intense theological conflict. Liberal theology was rising, and Van Til believed that Christian apologists were making a critical mistake. They were trying to meet skeptics on neutral ground, using reason and evidence that both parties could agree on. Van Til thought this conceded too much. Drawing from Dutch Calvinist philosophy, particularly the work of Abraham Kuyper and Herman de Weerd, Van Til argued that there is no neutral ground. Everyone approaches questions about God with fundamental presupposition shaped by their worldview. For Van Til, you're either thinking God's thoughts after him, or you're engaged in futile, autonomous reasoning that leads nowhere. Van Til's approach was revolutionary and controversial, even within Reformed circles. He insisted that Christian apologists should not merely present evidence for God, but should challenge the very foundations of non-Christian thought, exposing its internal contradictions and inability to account for knowledge, logic, and morality. His work was refined and popularized by his student Greg Bahnsen, especially in a famous 1985 debate with atheist philosopher Gordon Stein bondsperforming den Reformed Christians and brought presuppositional apologetics into the mainstream of evangelical culture. Bahnsen formalized the Transcendental Argument for God, arguing explicitly that logic, science, and morality presuppose the Christian God. Since Bahnsen, presuppositionalism has evolved and diversified. You have classical presuppositionists who stick closely to Van Til's original formulation, emphasizing the antithesis between Christian and non-Christian thought. Then you have people like John Frame, who tried to integrate presuppositionalism with other apologetic methods, creating what some call a softer presuppositionalism. Today, presuppositionalism is most prominent in Reformed and Calvinist circles, but it's gained broader popularity through online apologetics. Street preachers, YouTube apologists, and social media debaters often deploy presuppositional arguments, sometimes with more enthusiasm than philosophical sophistication. The argument has also been adapted by philosophers like Alvin Plantinga, though Plantinga doesn't identify as a presuppositionist. His Reformed epistemology shares the idea that belief in God can be properly basic, not requiring argument or evidence, but it differs from Van Til's more confrontational approach. In contemporary debates, you will often hear presuppositionists ask questions like, how do you account for the laws of logic in your worldview? Or on what basis do you condemn anything as morally wrong if there's no God? These challenges are meant to expose what presuppositionists see as the bankruptcy of atheistic or secular reasoning. Before we critique the argument, let's Steelman it. What's the strongest case a presuppositionist can make? First, there's an intuitive appeal to the argument. It does seem like certain things, logical laws, mathematical truths, moral obligations transcend the physical world. They seem universal, unchanging, and normative. The law of non-contradiction wasn't invented. It seems to be discovered. If you're a theist, it's natural to see these as reflections of God's nature. Second, presuppositionists make a fair point about foundational beliefs. Every worldview does rest on some axioms or starting assumptions. Whether you're a naturalist, a theist, or something else, you're working from basic beliefs about reality that you can't fully prove without circular reasoning. Presuppositionists are honest about this and challenge others to be equally honest. Third, there is a legitimate philosophical question here. How do we justify our confidence in reason, logic, and the uniformity of nature? David Hume famously showed that induction reasoning from past experience to future expectation can't be justified without circularity. Presuppositionists argue that theism provides a better answer. We can trust these things because God designed a rational, orderly universe and rational minds to comprehend it. Finally, presuppositionalism challenges what some see as unjustified confidence in naturalism. if our brains are just the products of blind, evolutionary processes aimed at survival rather than truth? Why should we trust them to deliver accurate beliefs about reality? This is called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And while it's not identical to presuppositionalism, it shares similar concerns. Now, let's examine whether the presuppositional argument actually works. I'll present several major objections. Objection 1. The problem of competing presupposition. Presuppositionists claim that only the Christian God provides a foundation for logic, morality, and reason. But this is an assertion, not a demonstration. Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and even Platonists could make similar claims about their own ultimate foundations. A Muslim could say, only Allah provides the necessary foundation for rationality and morality. A Platonist could argue that the eternal forms ground logic and mathematics. How do we adjudicate between these competing transcendental claims? The presuppositionist typically responds that only Christianity can account for these features without internal contradiction. But this requires actually demonstrating that Christianity succeeds where others fail, which brings us back to traditional evidentialist reasoning, the very thing presuppositionalism claimed to transcend. Objection 2. Logic doesn't require a mind. Presuppositionists often claim that logic requires a mind, specifically God's mind. But why think this is true? Laws of logic might be better understood as descriptions of necessary relationships, not prescriptions from a cosmic lawgiver. The law of non-contradiction states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. This seems to be a brute, necessary truth about reality, not something that requires a mind to think it. Consider, could God make the law of non-contradiction false? If yes, then logic is arbitrary and unreliable. If no, then logic constrains even God, suggesting it's more fundamental than any mind. Either way, the claim that logic requires God's mind is questionable. Philosophers like Quentin Smith and Graham Uppy have argued that logic and mathematics can be understood as necessarily true independent of any mind. They're not created. They're simply the structure of any possible reality. Objection 3. Naturalism can account for reason. Presuppositionists claim that atheistic materialism cannot account for logic, reason, or the uniformity of nature. But this is disputed. Evolutionary epistemology provides one naturalistic account. Our cognitive faculties evolved because they helped our ancestors survive. Accurate perception and reliable reasoning conferred survival advantages. While this doesn't guarantee our reasoning is perfect, it provides a reason to think it's generally reliable for navigating reality. Regarding the uniformity of nature, naturalists can point to the fact that the laws of physics appear to be expressions of symmetries and conservation principles. These aren't arbitrary. They may be necessary features of any stable universe. While we can't prove with absolute certainty that nature will be uniform tomorrow, this is a challenge for everyone, including theists. After all, how does the theist know God won't change the laws of nature tomorrow? Appealing to God's unchanging nature just pushes the problem back. How do you know God's nature is unchanging? You're ultimately relying on inductive reasoning from past experience, the same thing the naturalist does. Objection for the Euthyphro dilemma for logic. Here's a critical problem. Is logic logical because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's logical? If logic is logical simply because God commands it, then logic is arbitrary. God could make contradictions true, which is absurd. If God commands logic because it's already logical, then logic is independent of God, which contradicts the presuppositionist claim that God is the necessary foundation for logic. This is a version of the Euthyphro dilemma applied to logic rather than morality. Presuppositionists sometimes respond that logic reflects God's nature, so it's neither arbitrary nor independent. But this just reformulates the problem. Is God's nature logical because it's God's nature, or is it God's nature because it's logical? The dilemma persists. Objection 5. The argument proves too much. If presuppositionalism were sound, it would prove not just that God exists, but that Christianity is true. But the argument provides no mechanism for getting from some transcendent foundation exists to the God of Reformed Christianity exists. Why not deism? Why not a Platonic form of the good? Why not a universe-creating committee of gods? The leap from transcendental necessity to the specific God of Christian theism is enormous and unjustified by the argument itself. Objection 6. Is it self-refuting? Presuppositionists claim that atheism is self-refuting because it cannot account for the very logic and reason needed to argue for atheism, but this objection backfires. If presuppositionalism is true, then no one can genuinely reason to Christianity from a non-Christian starting point, because reasoning itself presupposes Christianity. This means presuppositionalism is self-sealing. You can only accept it if you already accept it. It becomes immune to rational evaluation, which is a mark of dogmatism, not sound philosophy. Moreover, presuppositionists use logic and reason to argue for presuppositionalism. But if their argument is correct, they can only do this by presupposing Christianity. This means they're arguing in a circle. Christianity is true because logic requires Christianity, and we know this because Christian reasoning tells us so. Objection 7. The practical problem. Even if we granted that some transcendent foundation is necessary for logic and reason, this wouldn't help us determine which religion is true or whether we should worship a god. Metaphysical foundations don't automatically generate practical obligations or religious devotion. Furthermore, presuppositionalism doesn't help with the evidential problems facing Christianity, the problem of evil, the historical reliability of Scripture, conflicting religious experiences, the demographic distribution of religious belief, and so on. Even if logic requires God, it doesn't tell us whether Jesus rose from the dead. So should the presuppositional argument convince a reasonable person? The answer is no, for several reasons. First, the argument relies on a false dichotomy. It assumes that either God grounds logic and reason, or nothing does, and we're left with chaos. But there are other options. Logic might be a brute necessity, grounded in the nature of reality itself, rather than in any mind. Second, even if we accepted that some transcendent ground is needed, the argument doesn't demonstrate that this ground is the Christian God specifically. The leap from transcendental necessity to Christian theism is unjustified. Third, the argument commits a kind of intellectual overreach. It claims to have solved the deepest problems in epistemology and metaphysics in a way that decisively favors one specific religious tradition. But philosophers have been debating these issues for millennia without consensus. The idea that Van Til cracked the code and proved everyone else wrong is implausible. Fourth, presuppositionalism ultimately amounts to question begging. It assumes what it sets out to prove. The argument only works if you already accept that logic, morality, and reason require God, which is precisely what's in dispute. Finally, the practical inaccessibility of the argument is telling. If God's existence is the necessary precondition for all reasoning, it should be obvious to everyone who reasons, but it's not. Brilliant philosophers, scientists, and thinkers throughout history have rejected theism while making extraordinary contributions to logic, mathematics, ethics, and science. If presuppositionalism were correct, this would be impossible. A reasonable person can acknowledge that naturalism faces genuine philosophical challenges, the problem of induction, the hard problem of consciousness, metaethical questions without concluding that Christianity is true. These are open questions in philosophy, and multiple worldviews attempt to address them. The presuppositional argument for God's existence is philosophically interesting and raises important questions about the foundations of knowledge and reasoning. It's valuable as a reminder that everyone operates with foundational assumptions and that these deserve examination. However, as a proof for God's existence, let alone for Christianity specifically, it fails. The argument assumes what it seeks to prove does not rule out alternative explanations, and doesn't bridge the gap from transcendental necessity to a specific deity. For these reasons, presuppositionalism functions better as an expression of faith seeking understanding than as a compelling argument for convincing skeptics. It may reinforce belief for those already committed to Christianity, but it's unlikely to persuade a reasonable person approaching the question without prior theological commitments. If you are interested in the existence of God, you're better off examining the classical arguments, engaging with the empirical evidence, exploring the philosophical problems faced by different worldviews, and reading widely across perspectives. Philosophy isn't about shutting down inquiry with transcendental claims. It is about following the arguments where they lead with intellectual honesty. Thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what you think about presuppositionalism. Have you encountered these arguments? Do you find them convincing? And if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and subscribe for more content. See you next time.